Hello, hello. Welcome back to Tuesdays with Dr. Susan. I'm sorry that we missed you last week. I was mostly dead. So, I did not want to subject anyone to the way I was sounding, and I was pretty much in bed for 3 days. But we're feeling much better today. So, we're glad to be here. I'm going to go ahead and run the intro, and then we'll bring Susan on and we will get started. Hi, I'm Nicole, and as you have probably guessed, I have ADHD. I live and breathe all things ADHD in my personal, family, and professional life. I have a background in psychology and special education, and I've gained a lot of knowledge over the years about ADHD, what it really is, how it touches every aspect of your life and the life of your child, as well as a wealth of information and strategies for living with ADHD and parenting kids with ADHD. In this community, we share stories, we learn together, and we support each other as we navigate all things ADHD. Welcome. Hello, lovely friend. How are you doing?
Hello, lovely friend. I hope you are well and recovered.
I'm about 93%, so I'll take it.
I'll take it. That's pretty good.
Try and mute if I need to cough.
Yes. Well, we have a great topic today on eligibility. And I, in fact, found data on what percent of IEPs are in each of the 13 eligibility criteria.
Oh, cool.
So I love information like that.
Yes.
Do you want to go ahead and define eligibility?
Yeah. So
no.
Well, my brain just paused. Just give me a second. Let me catch up. And what do we want to we'll talk about what eligibility is and then we'll go from there. Okay. So eligibility, we're specifically talking about eligibility for special education services or eligibility for a 504 plan. So we're going to kind of talk about those two separate things. Eligibility for special ed can be complex. So we're going to give a lot of information. Hopefully it won't feel like a fire hose. And it's possible we may have to split this up into this week and next week because it is a lot of information.
Yeah.
So there are certain criteria. We talked last week about kind of the three-pronged test, right? Whether or not they have a disability, whether or not that disability has an educational impact, and then do they require specialized instruction or related services. So those are the three things that we're talking about when we're talking about whether or not a child is eligible for that additional services and then would get an IEP, which is the plan with which to deliver those services. Anything to add?
Nope.
Okay. So when you show up to what they'll call the eligibility meeting, right? Last week talked about the referral process, and then they have these either 45 school days or 60 business days to do their evaluation, and then they're going to have what's called an eligibility meeting. Now, an eligibility meeting and an IEP meeting are two separate things. They are often done at the same time, but they do not have to be done at the same time. Once you're found eligible, there's an additional clock for when the IEP has to get done. So if you're feeling overwhelmed in that meeting, it's okay to be like, hey, let's come back to formulate the IEP after we've processed all of this information. So they're going to present
caveat.
Yeah.
An eligibility meeting gives you the results of the evaluations and assessments that were done in that 45-day or 60-day assessment period. Then the determination for eligibility is made, which is what we're going to talk about today.
By the entire team,
including parents.
The parent. So
and
they're
then
not into this meeting. They cannot walk into this meeting with your child is or is not eligible.
Right.
It is
so let me finish my sentence.
Meeting. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to say the sentence. So after the eligibility meeting, they determine if your child is eligible for services. If the answer to that is yes, by the team, as Nicole interrupted me to make sure we said, because it's so
it's very important.
And you're a part of that team. If they're determined to be eligible, then the decision is made whether they receive an IEP, as we've said multiple times in our sessions together over the past few months, because they need services as well as accommodations, or whether they're eligible for a 504 because they only require related services and accommodations, not special education services. So eligibility is prior to an IEP or a 504 meeting.
Right.
Okay, so I want to be clear that we're still not talking about IEP or 504 here. We're talking to something that happens prior to that, after the evaluation period is over, and to make the determination whether your child is eligible for either an IEP or a 504. So that's why I was interrupting you, Nicole, to stop you before we talked about IEPs. We're not even there yet.
Right. So I think maybe we should start with kind of what that information looks like that they're going to give you when you walk in that meeting, because it can be a lot. And it's not necessarily going to be presented in the exact same format everywhere, but we can kind of give you an idea of what the different tests are measuring, what those scores might look like, and what those scores might mean, because explaining that. And I think that's kind of an important part of that eligibility meeting, is that explanation of that testing. So
in previous sessions, we've talked about the 6 areas that the school or child find team has to evaluate your child in. And those are cognitive, academic, communication, fine and gross motor, and health. So they have to do an assessment of what your health needs are. And so the eligibility report that you receive has to give you information in each of these 6 categories. So
trying to pull something
cognitive, Are you putting something up on the screen? I'm not sure what
I'm trying to, but my keyboard is not working, so it's just giving me.
I'll talk until you interrupt me again.
Great.
The cognitive information you're going to receive is going to be some or all of a cognitive test, informally known as an IQ test. Okay, it's not the same thing, but informally known as an IQ test. Usually it will be a WIPSI, which is the preschool intelligence testing, a Wechsler, which is ages 5 through 16, or a WAIS,
they call the WISC, oftentimes the Wechsler.
Right, a WISC. And I think we're currently up to number 5 in terms of what the edition is, the 5th edition. And a WAIS is the Wechsler's adult intelligence test if your child is 16 and above. And so you will receive the scores from that test, including a verbal comprehension score, a nonverbal or visual spatial score, some kind of fluid intelligence score, which looks at problem solving. You'll get a performance score of some kind, working memory, and processing speed. And in addition to the combination of those scores, you'll get a full scale score most of the time. I'll give you a caveat in a minute, and a global ability score. Now, the caveat on your full scale score is that if you have tremendous variability, that means some of your scores are very highly rated and some of your scores are very lowly rated, then if there's a lot of difference in those scores, some of them are in the, say, superior range and some are in the low range, then the full scale score is considered invalid and should not be calculated. And many school psychologists are not aware of this and calculate it anyway, which will underrepresent your student's score, and you need to protest that or have your advocate protest that and say that that score is not valid. So if your child has scores in the, say, 120s, 130s, 140s, and also has scores in the 100s or below, a full-scale IQ score is generally considered not valid, because basically they're jumbling up the highs and lows and getting an average that doesn't actually match your child. Therefore, the global ability scale, which drops out the processing score and the working memory score, which are often, not always, but often the lowest scores, and only looks at the verbal, nonverbal, and fluid intelligence or problem-solving score, tends to be, always caveats, and there's always individual differences, but tends to be a more accurate and more valid representation of your child's IQ score if you have a twice exceptional child, like many of the children we've been talking about in all our weeks together on this podcast.
Yes.
Did you want to add anything to that, Nicole?
I think maybe just a few other cognitive tests you might hear. If they don't give a WISC for some reason, they might give a Woodcock-Johnson cognitive. There might be sometimes a nonverbal measure, something like is it the KABC2?
That's not nonverbal.
Right. No, I know that one's not nonverbal.
Yeah.
It's just another measure.
A nonverbal score, a nonverbal test could be the Raven mazes.
Mm-hmm.
It could be what's called a Naglieri or NN IQ, which is the Naglieri NV nonverbal intelligence test. So a Naglieri is nonverbal. The Raven's matrices is nonverbal. There's the Stanford Binet, which is another exactly equivalent to the Wechsler and completely valid with the same caveats about what the range of scores should look like.
Yeah. So you're going to have some sort of cognitive measure, right? And it's going to, I was trying to find, and it's not showing up, but you'll get kind of a chart that looks, this one's an achievement. I was trying to find a.
I prefer you didn't necessarily show the chart, but if you want to.
Well, just to, so people can see like.
Yeah, not every school gives charts anymore. They may just give a list of ranges. You get in the 90-something percentile means superior. The 80th percentile means above average. Remember the 50th percentile, a score of 100 is exactly average. And plus or minus 15, anything from 85 to 115 is considered an average score.
Yeah, and I'll pull up a chart on that in a minute, but we'll go past. Okay. So the next thing they're going to evaluate is going to be academics. So this they need to use, we've talked a variety of measures, right? So it can't just be their grades. It can't just be their state testing, although that is a piece of information that can be used. But usually you're going to also get a normative measure like a Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement that's going to break down their, so we have what in the testing world, we have we have achievement testing, and we have, why am I losing the word? Not cognitive.
I don't know. There's achievement versus cognitive. I don't know what else you're looking for.
Yeah, no, there's another word. It'll come to me in a minute.
Okay. So there's the Woodcock-Johnson, but many
ability testing, ability versus
testing.
Achievement, right? So the cognitive testing is going to be the ability, what your brain and how your brain processes and what you're able to do. And achievement is what you've learned.
Got it. And so very common now is to give the Wyatt, which is a Wechsler test. The Wyatt individual achievement testing breaks down just the same as the Woodcock-Johnson. They're entirely equivalent. No problem there. And they're both going to look at reading, math, and writing. And under writing or reading, depends on which test, is spelling. So basically,
usually they'll have a measure of fluency, comprehension, phonemic awareness, kind of breaking down what those different parts of reading, and then writing, written expression versus
spelling.
Yeah. And then in
Sometimes
math, you'll have math calculation and problem solving are usually the categories you'll see.
And word operations is
word attack.
No, that's under reading. Word operations under math.
Under math. Okay.
Word problems versus
Gotcha.
using algebra, using numbers.
Gotcha.
Right? And so you'll have some individual subscales in each of these tests, and then you'll have what's called broad reading, broad math, broad writing, and then you'll have a global score of some kind. Once again, you must look at your variability, because you could get an average score of 50%. The scores go by 100. 85 to 115 is considered average, but you could get in the 90s in reading and in the 40 percentiles in spelling and math, and your average score will turn out in the 60s, and you've missed the highs and lows in your students' strengths and weaknesses. So you need to look carefully and insist that your school give you the breakdown scores and not just the broad category scores.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the different eligibility categories, because you're going to use different pieces of information
to determine what disability is present.
Right.
So you want all this information to be in the report that you're
going to pull this up just for people who might not be super familiar with standardized testing and what these results can look like, right? So we've got here the standard bell curve, where the average is this right here, and one standard deviation is each line here. So
all you need to know about the term standard deviation, each of these sections in the picture, is that within that section, it tells us something about the growth or progress of your child. So where it says in the second set of orange, right, it says 100 and it says 85 to 115 in the pale orange. That's what I keep calling the average range. So IQ tests, achievement tests, many other tests.
Those are going to give you standard scores, and then you're going to find those here. Average is this 85 to 115. Typically, schools who are talking gifted usually put that line up at 125.
Yes. Some are 130, most are 125.
Right.
And it goes the other way down. As
then
you
down
go
here,
the other way, those are kids who have more
intellectual disability. Yeah.
Right. And that high score on either side, 145, is considered profoundly gifted. And then a score of 55 or less, actually 70 is the federal definition for intellectual disability.
Yeah. So there's some different numbers you're going to see on here. So when talking about, we got percentiles down here. So that middle of the curve is going to be the 50th percentile. So the exact middle. So the way I like to explain percentiles, and most of you probably know this, but just to review, if it's been a minute since you've been in math, is it's a kind of a ranking. If you had the average 100 average people in a room and you were ranking them 1 to 100, where would you fall? Right. So 50 is going to be dead average. If you're 99th percentile, then you're scoring higher than 99% of the population, right? So that's kind of what the percentile is.
I'm going to interrupt you again. You said 100 average people in the room. If you have 100 average people in the room, they will be all standing exactly in the middle because they're all average.
And a sample of
if you had a sample of people,
a sample of 100 people that it's the 100 people in a room thing is confusing because not very many are you going to have the 1% in that room.
Right.
But
the whole point of this is out of 100 people, only one is going to be in that profoundly gifted range, and only one is going to be at that 55 or lower. It just doesn't happen. However, 68% will be, that means 68 out of those 100 people will be between 85 and 115. So you'll have one person with severe intellectual disability. You will have one who's profoundly gifted. 68 of those 100 people will be between 85 and 115. Right. And everybody else will be somewhat less intelligent or somewhat more intelligent, because that's what the bell curve means. That's the way we
that's how it is normed
as human beings.
And how the scores are determined is based on when they do normative sampling to set the norms for the scores on the tests. That's how they do it. They take those percentages and then they line it up with those numbers. The other number to look at here that you'll see on some measures, usually the ones you see T-scores on are going to be like the BASC, which is a behavior checklist. So T-scores.
The brief, which is the executive functioning test.
Yeah. So some more of the checklist ones, as opposed to kind of the face-to-face ones, will often give T-scores. And a T-score, the average is 50, and it has a standard deviation of 10. So as opposed to standard deviation of 15 that you have on a standard score, it's of 10. So it's a little, the scores look a little bit differently. But if you need to pull up a chart like this to help you figure out the numbers that they give you, you can find a bell curve like this really easily.
And you can just Google bell curve and this picture will show up. Now, in those kinds of tests where we're looking for issues or problems, right? The scores will be in the 60s, mean your child is at risk for a problem. And in the 70s or higher means your child has a severe problem in that area.
Yeah, that's considered clinically significant. And on the other side too, because some of them are skills that, like, you might have a high score is significant and some are like a low score is significant. So like attention is going to be one that is going to be on a low number that's clinically significant. But when they give you the chart of the basket, has it kind of highlighted out.
It's actually the other way around. The attention would be on the high level. The ones that are on the low level are social functioning, adaptability, problems with teachers, and so on. Yeah. It's okay. I know those by heart.
You do a lot more of this than I do.
I do the testing. You know, I've already had, I don't know, 3 IEP meetings for clients last week, and I'll have 2 more later this week. So so you'll see some of both, but the ones that are in T-scores are ones where we're looking for difficulties. The ones that are on a mean of 100,
clinically significant label is what you're looking at.
The achievement and IQ scores are a mean of 100.
Right.
Thank you. That was so
helpful in just reading some of the scores you'll get.
Now, when we get to the communication piece and we're looking at the reading and the articulation and speech and pragmatic language scores, most of those are going to be, they range from the T-scores of 50 and the average scores of 100. Same issues arise. We're looking for difficulties with expressive, the ability to express yourself in speech. And we're looking for, in those cases, high scores would mean you're well able to express yourself. And receptive language. How well does your child understand what people are saying to them?
Right.
And high scores there would mean that your child is not doing well with, you're having difficulties with understanding what people are saying to them. And it also includes measures of pragmatic language, which are social skills. And so when we ask for assessments of pragmatic language, and so this is their ability to do turn taking, understand initiatives, to have social relationships with others, or presenting initiatives. Can they ask questions? Can they respond to other people's questions? Can they take turns? Can they interact with others multiple times in a row? Can they maintain a social relationship? And all of that is assessed by the speech. Whoops, sorry, my camera went out. Let's see. If my camera will come back. There we are. Sorry about that. So anytime we have social issues, for example, when we're looking at a potential diagnosis of autism, the speech language pathologist is the person who assesses those issues. So that would be in that section of the eligibility report that you as the parent receive.
So some different behavior scales you might see. We've mentioned the BASC, Behavior Assessment Scale for Children. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Okay. Like, I feel like I'm saying that wrong. The brief we talked about, which is a measure of executive functioning. There are measures of adaptive behavior, which adaptive behavior is kind of your functional living skills. So are you able to get around in public, take care of, get yourself dressed, feed yourself, things like that. So adaptive behavior as opposed to other behavior. Sometimes you might see a Connors, which is an ADHD scale. I'm not seeing that one as frequently in schools.
They give Vanderbilts.
Vanderbilts is another one.
The Connors was supplanted by the Vanderbilt quite a long time ago now.
Yeah. I don't know. What else? What am I missing?
Not too much, actually.
Okay.
Those are
the most common ones.
Plus, they'll do classroom observations.
Yes.
The social worker or psychologist will come in on at least 2 occasions, and it should be 4 or more if they have time to observe your child in both structured settings, such as the classroom, doing a structured activity, and unstructured settings, such as recess or the cafeteria, or a special class, such as music or art, where they're doing not, say, a structured lesson, but they're working independently so that they get a sense of what your child's behavior is like compared to students without disabilities.
And then other areas that will test, they're going to test vision and hearing. So that's the first thing they've got to rule out. They will test motor and fine motor. So that can be occupational therapy will come and do an evaluation to assess how they move around. And then things like handwriting, cutting with scissors, things like that, the little movements. You have the big movements and the little movements, and how that might be impacting them.
Most importantly, they should do a sensory assessment.
Yes.
And so a couple of points here. So we do assessments of what we call OT, occupational therapy, and PT, or physical therapy. Not every school district has 2 separate people in these jobs. So you have to ask,
right,
who's coming to do these assessments and what's their training, depending on the needs of your child. So for example, if you have a child who has a physical disability, such as cerebral palsy, you want an actual physical therapist from the district to come do a trained assessment on them for their physical therapy. If there's just an occupational therapy person who comes to the school, because most people are dealing with sensory or small movement issues, that person is not going to do an adequate assessment on your child if you know they have a large movement issue.
Yeah, gross motor.
Right? So
usually in the schools that I've worked in, typically, when it comes to OT, right, they might have an OT tech who comes in and delivers services when it comes to like handwriting and sensory diets and things like that, but they are supervised by a licensed occupational therapist, and that is the person who will do the assessment.
Right. Same with the physical therapy.
So
you have to ask that 2
they are being split between, a quadrant of a school district or the entire school district, depending on the size
And
fun.
then again, if you have a child that you know has sensory issues or autism-related sensory issues, you must ask for more than just a screening instrument to be done. Because while a screening instrument will identify the presence of sensory issues, it will not do the in-depth sensory assessment that your child may need to develop what Nicole referred to as a sensory diet, which is the interventions that your child may need. So a screener, a sensory screener, is not sufficient, and you need the OT to come in and do an actual sensory assessment. And there are several different instruments that can be used for that. They're different in different school districts. But more that you have to make sure you ask that you don't want a tech, an OT tech, who's usually a student or intern, to just do a sensory screener. You want an in-depth sensory assessment to be done on your child as part of their OT evaluation.
Right.
And again, what we're telling you is what you should look for. One, you should request at your consent for evaluation that we talked about a couple sessions ago, but that you should look for this information in this
in the eligibility meeting when they sit down and start giving you all of these scores. These are the questions to ask. What measures were used? Who did the assessment?
And look for the data.
And find those numbers.
So
you're going to sit down in this meeting and you're going to get a whole bunch of numbers.
Right. So the one last piece of data, in addition to under health, in addition to the vision and hearing assessment, is there must be a interview by the school or district nurse of the parents. And the last one I attended, they didn't do this, and I had to say, this isn't complete. You didn't interview the parents. And in fact, we needed to do that because he has in addition to a cerebral palsy and autism, he has multiple physical disabilities that require information to the school so they understand his needs properly. And there was a new disability label just given 3 days before the meeting by a doctor that the school needed to know about, which they knew nothing about because no one had ever called the parents to get an updated health report.
Yeah, they need a health history and a developmental history.
Right.
And sometimes
it can be summarized in one paragraph, but this interview must be done.
Yes, usually they have a form of questions that they'll ask you, that they'll go over, and they may ask for, if there are medical diagnoses, they may ask for documentation of that from a medical doctor. That can sometimes just simplify the eligibility process, especially when it comes to like autism as an educational, because you got educational classification of autism is not the same thing as a medical diagnosis of autism. But if you have that medical diagnosis, it can make the process of eligibility a lot quicker and easier.
Now, here's the really important piece. The school is going to ask for releases of information to speak to all the medical doctors involved. Do not sign them, ever.
Oh, I've never had them ask that. That's interesting.
All the time.
I've never had them ask it. We've just brought a letter or a copy of a report.
You do not want to give unfettered access of a school to your medical doctors because they may ask questions, one, that are inappropriate, information that a school system does not need, and your doctor may share information that you did not want the school to have for some reason, which is your right to not have information shared with the school. Instead, tell the school to tell you what they need, such as the list of diagnoses your child has and the reason why they have that diagnosis. And as Nicole said, have your doctor write a letter. This way, all information comes through you. You can share the information you want to. And the school, for example, I've had schools who call doctors and ask about other members of the family. I've had, like siblings. I've had them ask about the parents. Do you think they're good parents? Right. Do you think they're taking proper medical care of this child? Those are non-educational questions that can be used in legal cases, that can be used in child neglect cases. You as the parent need to control the flow of information.
Yeah. You can also, if you have an outside evaluation done, you can ask the psychologist to give you a briefer or a different a copy of the report that doesn't include all of the information that is in your full psychological report. You can have them create one that is just for educational purposes, because if you're doing a comprehensive evaluation, you're going to have a lot of that kind of family information that doesn't necessarily need to be shared with the school.
Absolutely.
So you can ask the psychologist to either just write a letter, or if the school is wanting to use that testing as part of, their evaluation, you can ask the psychologist to just write up a report specifically for the purposes of the educational evaluation. And they can leave out some of that background history and things like that don't need to be included.
I always ask that it include school-related recommendations, as well as the testing results.
Right.
Good point, Nicole. Okay, so this is what should be and what could be anywhere between a 15 and 30-page report. So I want you to be prepared that if it's a good and actually comprehensive evaluation, that it's going to be
a lot of information.
And you should ask for it to be sent to you a minimum of 2 or 3 days prior to the meeting, so that, one, you can read it yourself. And two, if you have an advocate like me or Nicole, you have time to discuss it with us and figure out what questions you want to ask prior to going into the meeting. You should never, please, my strongest advice, walk into a meeting like this unprepared.
Yeah. So they can send you a copy of their results ahead of time for you to review before the eligibility determination meeting.
And if they say it's not going to be ready until the day of,
then you say, I guess we better reschedule, because I would like to review that information before the meeting.
And as we always say, if they ask you why, we'll explain it to you. You say, because this is what it says in the law, IDEA, it says full parental participation is required, and you can't have full participation if you haven't had a chance to read it, look up information, or get help from your community prior to the meeting.
Yeah. It's usually not a problem, but if you do get pushback, those are the words you use. Full parental participation is another one of those magic phrases.
So here in Colorado, El Paso County, which is where Colorado Springs, our second biggest city, is, third biggest now. I think Aurora might be bigger now. In any case, they have regularly refused to provide copies of reports or IEPs. So I regularly walk into meetings. They distribute the report to everybody. My client and I stand up and say, thank you so much for this report. We need time to read it and discuss it. We'll get back to you to reschedule the meeting. This has happened half a dozen times at least.
And another reason why we always recommend having an advocate.
Yeah.
There are free resources available for you to get an advocate if you can't afford to pay one.
And I always have an advocate. About the book From Emotions to Advocacy by Pam and Pete Wright. That book describes every test we've mentioned here, goes through the bell curve like we've mentioned here, and is another great resource to help you understand this report.
It does often feel like a fire hose of information. Having someone there to help is always a good idea,
Yeah.
and especially in this meeting.
I'm just seeing, we don't have any questions in the comments yet, do we, Nicole?
No.
Okay.
I guess this might be a good time as well to, if they're presenting you with information and it feels like it is not describing your child at all, you really disagree with the results, this is that time that you can ask for the independent educational
So let's
evaluation.
talk about that then. So at the end of this, the first form you're going to fill out is going to ask you, do you believe this has been a comprehensive, that's the key word, evaluation of your child? You have the right to say no. And your no will veto the report.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the right to say yes if you feel like they've done a good job at the school, and the vast majority of these reports are good enough.
Yes.
Nicole and I get to talk about the ones that aren't.
Because that's when we get involved sometimes. Right. It's usually because there's been an issue.
So you have a couple things to do here. If you feel that they have not done more than a superficial report, you have not seen all the tests that Nicole and I have gleefully talked about today. I couldn't get that word out. You have the right to say no. I don't see enough information. I don't see anything on executive functioning. I don't see anything on pragmatic language. You didn't complete the full cognitive testing. Some school districts only do some of the subtests and don't complete the whole test because they say, oh, we didn't need to. We don't need an IQ score. Well, I want to see one to see what my kid is really dealing with. They, didn't do the full sensory assessment. All these things we've marked off for you. You can say, no, I don't think this is a comprehensive report.
Yeah.
Then you have 3 or 4 options. Often, not always, but often the school will say, we're so sorry. We'll go back and fix that. Give us another 2 weeks. Right. And I'll often say yes to that if I feel we've been having a good faith discussion and the school acknowledges that they didn't do a good job.
Yeah, or sometimes in the conversation of going over these reports, questions might come up and they'll be like, oh, that's a good question. We didn't do this. We could do an additional measure on this thing because, there's something funky in the results that nobody can, you can't pinpoint. Why do you think that happened? Or maybe it was just the kid had a really bad day of testing that day. And so you don't feel like the team didn't feel like it was accurate and they need to do some additional. So there's lots of reasons. And most of the time it's not something nefarious that the school is doing.
Exactly. So the school may be okay with that and say, and set a clear timeline, everybody, because we've already used up that first 60 days, right? So set a clear timeline and a date in your calendar. You'll get a new copy of this report within 14 business days. And this is what it's going to include. We're going to redo such and such and such and such a test. Okay. I'm good with that. The second thing is
we had this happen with my youngest when he was 3 years old at his evaluation, because he had been in early intervention. He turned 3. It got transferred over to the school district. He had initially qualified for early intervention on language, but over that year, he had had a huge burst in his language. He no longer qualified under language, but they had done minimal behavioral testing. They had I think they gave a Vanderbilt or something similar, but they hadn't done a Basque. And I said, and so they were saying, well, he doesn't qualify under speech anymore. I said, well, let's do some additional areas. We did a Basque real quick, and sure enough, clinically significant in attention and externalizing behaviors at 3 years old. So that's pretty significant.
Yes.
Because that's kind of the hallmark of 3-year-olds is externalizing behavior and limited attention.
Another example is where they don't do any autism testing,
right?
To see if he has the educational diagnosis. The behavior stuff is off the chart. The sensory stuff is off the chart. but the psychologist didn't think to do one of the autism rating scales. Well, then we clearly don't have a full picture here, and the team will acknowledge that in most cases. And they simply need to do the formal autism rating to get that eligibility done. So that happens commonly. So not so many school districts in good faith will agree with you that it's not a comprehensive evaluation. Good. Best case scenario.
They don't.
If they don't, if you don't have an advocate, at this point, you say no to the comprehensive. You ask them if they'll do more testing. If they say no, we won't do more testing, you say, I need to get myself an advocate for help. I'll be in touch with you within the week to decide on next steps. And you go online to the Council for Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPAA.org, and you find yourself an advocate in your area. Or you contact me or Nicole.
You can also ask the school for the contact information for their parent center or their advocate. It might be called something different.
No.
But a lot of them do. Or your pediatrician's office might. But there will be a contact. Every LEA, we've talked about, local educational authority, is required by law to have some sort of parent center set up.
So what Nicole is referring to is also through IDEA. Every state has a state parent and training agency. You can just Google that. State Parent Training Agency, and it comes up. Or you can Google Find Your Parent Center, and it will come up by state. Every state has one. The one in Colorado is called Peak Parent Center.
In Utah, it's called the Utah Parent Center.
And so every state has one.
Yeah, they all have a different name. So sometimes it can be a little tricky to find.
So that's why you can Google State Parent Training and Information Center Special Education, because it'll come up for other topics.
You put that in there. You'll just
find your parent center. There's a map that comes up. You click your state and you find the one for your state. They often have free or low cost advocates, but I have to tell you, you get what you pay for.
Yes, sometimes
they're going to be the most experienced
and wonderful, and sometimes they are not, and it can be a roll of the dice. But it's a good place to start if you can't find anything.
Or you can't afford a private
or you can't afford a private pay advocate. They also will have a lot of educational resources just on the website available that you can read through. And then if you need further help finding an advocate, reach out to Susan or I, and we'll help you find somebody.
Right. So what's the next step? You and your advocate, I hope, that you'll be able to find easily, or one of us will help you find, will help you make a request for, and you've heard us say this in earlier episodes, an IEE, an Independent Educational Evaluation. What that is a either psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluation that will either fill in the gaps for what the school did or didn't do, or even do some evaluations that are alternatives
to their own comprehensive evaluation using different measures.
Right, because you can't repeat the same tests mostly within a year, 6 months to a year, that the school district has to pay for at the prevailing public price. Now that's important, because I've had school districts say they'd pay $800, but the prevailing local price is $3,500, which means that's sort of the average of what people in the community are charging. And the school district says, oh, we're only going to pay $800. And if you don't know this because you haven't heard me tell you, you'll think, oh, I can't afford anybody, this won't work. But you can come back to your school district, or your advocate will, and say, bullshit to you, forgive my language, but
these
the
are
law
the
says
it's
it's prevailing price in your community.
So you're not going to get them to pay for the most expensive person in the state. You're not going to get them
You
to pay
won't
for
get
a
the
$5,000 evaluation.
but you'll get the $3,000.
Unless maybe you're in California, because that's what everybody charges in California.
Right.
But
In other words, it might be more expensive in California, so you will get the $6,000 one.
Right.
Because somebody there charges 10.
Right.
But in our states, Utah and Colorado, the prevailing price is around $3,000. You will get the $3,000 one, which will be an excellent neuropsychological eval.
There's a couple of different ways that you can go about finding someone. You can find someone. The district will have a list of people. You don't have to pull from that list. It's not these are the only people we will pay. Yes.
They can't restrict you
who it is. It's a list of recommendations that they've worked with in the past. We're on a couple of lists that we work with a few school districts around the area when they have IEPs.
Using her clinic is a great idea.
If you're in Utah, give us a call at Milestone Neurodevelopment Center. We do IEs
regularly.
Yeah.
And I have a list of people that I recommend and refer to here in Colorado because I don't do evaluations anymore. But here's the deal.
And again, if you can't find someone, reach out to Susan or I, and we can help you find someone.
In whatever state you are.
Wherever you are. Yep.
And again, your state parent training and information center should be able to provide you with some information as well.
Yeah.
But remember, the school cannot restrict you only to their list of people and only to their required price.
The district will
anyway.
My experience anyway is that if you bring that name to the district, they will reach out to the person and just check in qualifications and do a few things like that and set up how because the school district will pay them directly. Right. So once you have your name, you give it to the person at the school that's handling it. There's usually someone in the district office that is handling IEEs, and they will communicate with the school, but the report goes to you
and the school simultaneously.
Yes.
So you have no privacy rights in this report.
Right.
Everything that the person writes and says belongs to the school because the school paid for it. One downside that I have to remind you about.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when, if you're speaking with your psychologist and there is, medical information that you do not want put in the report, oftentimes they will work with you on it if it's not relevant to the educational evaluation part of it.
So be aware when you speak to your person, even though
you talk to them and let them know.
Right?
Like that there's this piece of medical information that we would not like shared with the district. Please don't put it in your report. Most psychologists will work with you on that if it's a reasonable request and they don't feel like it is undermining the integrity of their evaluation.
Exactly. Now, here's one last caveat you need to know. Even though the school district has paid for this evaluation as required by law, all they're required to do is consider it.
Right.
They are not required to accept any of the recommendations, including a recommendation that the child receive an IEP or a 504. They're only required to consider the results. Now, again, like we said at the beginning, the majority of schools say, great, we love all this new information.
Yep. And they're happy to have it. When you come in with a full comprehensive eval, whether it's an IEE or one you've done privately, that's less work that they have to do.
Right.
And it's a very comprehensive. If you've gone to someone who knows what they're doing, there's going to be really helpful information. I loved reading those reports as a special ed teacher, even after eligibility was finished, if there was something in that file, because it helped me to understand that kid better.
Exactly.
And it helped me as a special ed teacher to be able to develop instruction, deliver instruction. I was working with a lot of kids with severe behavior and mental health conditions.
Right.
So having that information helped me to interact and help my kid better. So most of the time they are happy to have more information to help them understand your kid, because like we said, most of the time the schools really are in it for your kid. The teachers, people who go into education are in it because they want to help kids.
Yes.
Principals get a little off track. I don't know what it is about principals.
We're going to have a separate session.
But everybody else on the team is generally awesome.
Right?
Oh my gosh, I have so
many.
We want to
remind you that even though you said no to the team, because they said no, they said, we don't find him eligible. We don't think he deserves an IEP. You've said, no, we don't agree with you. And so we want you to pay for this additional eval. They might rethink their whole thought process once they see more information. We're just, we see the bad cases. We see the ones.
I would also recommend, if you do get an IEE, oftentimes those psychologists are happy to attend meetings with you, virtually or in person.
Yes.
Almost every time we've done an IEE in our clinic, the psychologist goes to the meeting with the family to help explain their testing and their recommendations. One thing when you're looking for someone to do these kinds of evals, especially if you're doing an IEE, is look at kind of their training and their level of expertise, because I will say, like, my husband's kind of an exception to a lot of neuropsychologists because his original training was in school psychology. So he spent a lot of years in school psychology before he went into private practice and then did the work that he needed to do to be doing independent evaluations, right? So when he gives recommendations and reports, they are highly applicable to what he knows will be available in the schools. Many, many psychologists will write these reports and they will give recommendations that are completely unfeasible. So if those recommendations are unreasonable, the school's going to say, well, we can't meet these. Right. So that is something when you're speaking to people about evaluations, is what kind of experience do they have working with schools? Because it makes a huge difference in the kinds of recommendations they give and how likely you are to be able to get those recommendations actually done at the school.
As an advocate, I'll often, once we meet with the new person who's doing the IEE, I'll offer as advocate to meet with the person either once they do their first draft or even prior to them, writing the report, or with the family when they're giving their feedback to help shape the recommendations into a useful report. So that's a service I offer as an advocate.
That's awesome. And that's another thing when you're looking at advocates, when you're looking at hiring a private advocate, like, Susan's not taking on new advocacy clients these days, but her background, she came from clinical psychology. So when you're talking about being able to understand and interpret these tests, finding someone who understands, like I was not in psychology my undergrad's in psychology. My master's is in special ed, but I've been working with my husband in a clinical setting for so long that I understand a lot of these testing better than some, because people come to advocacy work from all avenues. So whether or not they really understand psychological testing can be really helpful when you're looking for an advocate.
Such a good point. Now, I know we only have a couple more minutes. We're going to have a continuation on this.
Yeah, I think next week we're going to
eligibilities.
Yes, we're going to talk about the different eligibility categories, what the requirements are to meet eligibility in the various categories, what testing absolutely needs to be done for some of them at every point. Sometimes in a reeval, they aren't going to do every single bit of testing, but things that absolutely have to be done for each disability category, because there are a lot of rules.
Right. We haven't even talked about reevals. Everything we said today, people, only applies to initial evaluations. Some of it is true of reevaluations, your every 3-year reevals. Some of it will be the same, but some of it is different.
So and I think we'll have a separate session at the end of this series that talks about the reevaluation process.
Okay, good. Let's do that.
And when the school comes to you and says, we want to exit your kid from special ed.
That's a different type of reeval.
Because that is a conversation and something that I think a lot of parents don't realize how many rights they have. So yeah, that's on our list through going through this Getting Help at School.
Okay, so next week we'll talk about the 13 eligibility categories.
Yes.
Notice I said categories because it's not 13 types of disabilities.
Correct.
It's 13 eligibility categories, which cover over 20 types of disabilities.
Yes. What those definitions are, because they're going to take all this testing and they're going to go, okay, this, that, and the other. There's some complicating factors in a few of ones. I think the ones that's probably the trickiest is that specific learning disability, because it can be a beast.
I have my handout to guide me in that discussion.
Fantastic. I've got a few as well. So that's going to be a great discussion, what the eligibility categories are. Let people know where they can find you, Susan.
Yes, you can find me at drsusanblumberg.com. Very easy. And if you just want to have an informal conversation about advocacy or eligibility, or you'd like to talk with me about working with your teen or younger adult, call coachsusan.com.
Fantastic. So we will see you next week to continue this eligibility discussion. If you have a friend, a family member who has questions about this process, if their kid is struggling at school and they don't know where to go, please share this series with them. There's so much information in here that's helpful to parents. And make sure to do all the YouTube-y things and help, because the algorithm is not liking me lately. I don't know why. I'm working on figuring that out, but we would love to see this channel continue to grow.
Nicole has ADHD. Everybody click and subscribe.
Yes, I do.
We need you.
Fierce today.
You were focused today, Nicole.
I took my meds.
I didn't mean to out you. I meant to.
It's good. I took my meds and I've been crunching on these chocolate covered espresso beans, and that helps too.
All right. I'll remind you in the future. Thank you so much for having me today, Nicole.
So happy to see you, and we will see you all next week.
See you next week.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This video is not a substitute for counseling, psychotherapy, medical, or mental health care. The information and advice shared here should not be used in place of any form of diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Information provided here does not involve diagnosis or treatment of medical or mental or psychological disorders. If you feel the need for professional support, please seek a local professional in your area. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only.